On this episode, we're having a conversation about graphic design and church communications. The truth is, good design matters. And we're here to help you recognize good design, but maybe even more importantly, to avoid bad design. Let's go.
Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the Church Juice podcast, where we are here energizing church communications. I'm your host, Brian Haley, and I'm joined by Jeanette Yates.
Hey, that's me. Oh my goodness. So this is going to be a fun episode, I think, because we mention graphic design in our episodes, Brian, but we don't often get down to the actual design elements and why it's so important. So I'm really excited today to bring on Josh Starr. He is the owner of Pixel Painters, which we will have him tell us all about here in a minute. But just to let you know a little bit about him, he is a preacher's kid, grew up in the church, and then he went from preacher's kid to working with Fortune 100 clients to serving in ministry with his wife. He's also the father of two wonderful children, and he is passionate about helping churches with graphic design. And so in 2018, he started Pixel Painters, and we're going to be letting him teach us about good graphic design today. So let's go ahead and jump on in.
That's right. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, man. It's a blessing to be part of this. So I really appreciate you guys.
Absolutely. So you're a pastor's kid. You've been in ministry. How did you even get into design in the first place?
Yeah, so growing up in the church as a pastor's kid, I saw a lot of the behind the scenes, and I swore that I'd never work in church, honestly. I was like, I'm not going to do it. So I went into school for illustration and design down in Clearwater, Florida, and just loved the design side. And down there's just a bunch of agencies. And so I was blessed with really getting a great job at a big agency doing illustration design. And it was kind of at the beginning of the e-commerce world. One of our big clients, I was building these illustrated, animated web pages for Walmart.com. And I just loved it. I absolutely loved doing this and got to work with a ton of just really cool clients and a lot of their new product rollouts. But like everyone, I think I was young and I overworked for a couple years. I was like, man, I love this so much. I was like, man, I was working so many hours that at one point I was newly married and I thought, man, what would it be like to work at a church at this point? What would going into ministry look like as a designer? I didn't know. I just thought you had to be a pastor or a youth minister. I didn't know you could use illustration or design skills. So I found a job at a church up in Kentucky that needed a graphic designer, web designer. And so that was kind of what got me back into ministry at that point.
Yeah, I'm glad you kind of made that turn to kind of talk about how you got back into ministry, because I was like, how do you make that jump? So you're working with this church as a graphic designer, and then in 2018, you decide to start Pixel Painters. And so I want you to tell us a little bit about what made you start that and how that whole process went.
Yeah, so like I said, I was working at this pretty large church because if you have a budget to hire a graphic designer and a whole creative team, you have to have enough members and a big enough budget to pay for that in the church. So I think the church was around 8,000 members at that point. It's pretty large. And so I worked there was probably 30 or 40 ministries a part of the church. And so I got to work with ministry leaders and do their event graphics and website things and wayfinding signs and the whole 9 yards for graphic design. When I left there to start my business, I realized that it's not just the big churches that need that help. It's the small churches, it's the medium churches, but those churches don't necessarily have the budget to hire a full-time person to sit at a desk. And so it was kind of this aha moment in 2018 where I thought, there's all kinds of these subscription model services. If we did a subscription model and we split it across multiple churches, then it would be affordable for them. And the risk for me was, can I get enough churches to do that subscription model to where I would absorb the cost of this full-time graphic designer and split the work? Because, smaller churches need the same quality. They have the same needs, communicating the gospel and communicating clearly, but they might not have 40 hours of work for a designer.
Well, and I think too, when you're not a graphic designer, it's really hard even to use some of the tools they have out there to help non-graphic designer people like me do that. You still don't, if you don't have that eye, if you don't have that training, it takes too much time. And then you're not able to be in ministry as much as you'd like to because you're trying to figure out how to use some tool. So it's nice to have somewhere you can go to have that stuff done and done well.
Let's dive into that a little bit more. You obviously work with a lot of churches through Pixel Painter. And like Jeanette was just saying, a lot of churches or church, designers or communicators, whatever their role is, they don't have that skill. So let's talk about design a little bit. Why is design so important, especially in the church? Why is design important in communications?
Yeah, so I hear a lot from the churches we work with when we're doing projects, and you've probably heard this too, that you'll know it when you see it. It's this general feel of like, that good design communicates clearly. That it helps with your message. It helps get people to events. Like it helps in a very practical sense. It helps deliver your message well. And so as far as good design, good design when you see it, bad design when you see it, but it's hard to really teach that to a volunteer or teach it to, a ministry leader, that it takes typography, it takes spacing. There's a lot on the actual study side that it takes to learn and kind of work through. But for us, I always see us as a ministry partner alongside the church. Like there's a lot of bad mojo out there with designers with like big egos. And it's like, this is my design and you're, if you don't like it, then I'm leaving type of mentality. And so we want to communicate the gospel clearly. We want to communicate on behalf of the churches. And so that they get people listening and hearing scripture well, they get people understanding when and where events are. But ultimately, like we want to be a partner with them. Like we don't want to choose a design that's too complicated, that doesn't ultimately deliver what it's supposed to, and it's supposed to communicate clearly.
Yeah, so good design communicates clearly, gets people to do whatever action you want them to do, come to the event or find the nursery, whatever. What is a common mistake or bad design?
Certain personalities like to put a lot of text in things, so they like to say, all right, let's just fill this. If it's an event flyer, let's fill it with everything, because they think everyone's going to need all this information. But really the point is to like that entry level into the event. So for event graphics per se, it could be, let's do a whole flyer and it's just a ton of text in there. And so that's like a big pitfall of over communicating.
That is probably the biggest problem I see. You're saying it's one of the ones that you see all the time. How can they stop making that error? Because I know this happened when I was working at my church. We would say, oh, this had too much. Next time we're not going to do this. And then it was like, oh, but we have, so how do we stop doing that?
Yeah, I was actually listening to a podcast this morning and he had an analogy of juggling. So he was talking about, and you might be able to juggle 3 balls at once, but when you get into juggling 4 or 5 or 6, it's really hard to not start dropping balls. So as we communicate these things, I would think through, put yourself in that either visitor or member shoes, have some empathy and understand that they have multiple balls that they're juggling already. And so when you're communicating, they're not going to have the time to read through this entire flyer or whatever it is to really get the purpose. Like just choose one action step. And so if that's like an event, say, who is this event for? What's and where is it? And then the visual style can grab them and get them to actually look at it initially. And then the text kind of communicates who's it for and where is it? And then let them decide if they want more information. You can, of course, put more information maybe on the website or something. But for that initial kind of attention grabber, you're not going to grab their attention if it looks like a huge page of text or like a book report or something. And so over communicate and just think of one action item.
I was really glad when the QR code came back into style and we got to start using those on flyers again. And then I thought, oh, is that like a no-no?
So there's all kinds of different churches. It really depends on who the audience is. Whenever I communicate with churches, it's if you're using the QR code, make sure the audience that it's intended for knows how to use it. Otherwise, the purpose of the QR code has failed miserably. So it depends. If it's a younger audience, then yeah, go for it. If it's an older one that don't know what it is, and then the ultimate purpose is going to be lost.
Yeah, I think that was a good point, though. We talk about this a lot, that everything you do needs to have a clear next step or a call to action, right? So you need to, as you're designing stuff or thinking through I mean, we talked about events a little bit, but like when you're designing a flyer, what's the next step? It's not just showing up. You want them to go to your website to get more information or to register or whatever. So, kind of simplifying what you do and think through that next step, I think is really important. And I'm glad that you pointed that out. What are some principles, I guess, or just foundational things that could help a church communicator grab hold of their design work? Because like you were talking a little bit, a few minutes ago, a lot of people have so many things going on. So if my job is administrator, but I also have to do design work, what are some just key principles that would help me improve my work?
Yeah, one of the most helpful things that I can share is what I call the Whiplash Effect. And you guys might have heard this before in different areas, is when we communicate for churches, the visual style, the branding, how it makes the audience feel is one thing. And whenever this visitor or this member or whoever comes to the event or they come to a weekend service, they might feel a completely different thing. And so the whiplash effect is, say your design is just terrible, just like the worst design of all time, but then they come to the event or they come to a weekend service and it's a very well-produced, very friendly, just great connection. And so the whiplash effect it was completely opposite of what that person saw. And so what you want to do is you want to have a consistent strategy and feel for the design and how this person experiences things in person. I know you guys have probably talked through this a ton, as authenticity is key, especially as we communicate these things. And so you want to be authentic in a way that's consistent. And so you want really great graphics that communicate, but also the inverse. If they come to a weekend service and it's a disaster and they don't feel welcomed, then it's almost like I feel like I got cheated, like they got me here, but it's not really consistent. And so the whiplash effect is, don't do that, be consistent in how you communicate.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that when we talk about website, and like your plan a visit page or whatever, or the graphics that you post on social media have to actually reflect your church. So like, there is also this debate, about like, should you use stock photos or not? And it's like, well, if you have to, you can, but make sure they looks like it sort of represents your, what's going on at your church, So that's a good point. I like that. And yes, it is, I just was thinking as you were talking about how many times people show up expecting one thing and getting another based on what the flyer said, or maybe even like you say, what it looked like this. And so that's a good point. At Church Juice, we have a ton of church communicators following us and listening to this podcast and hanging out with us in the Church Juice Facebook group. And they wear a lot of hats, like we all do. So quality design, improving your design skills is often, like they're just like, I just need to get it done. I don't have time to do any better than I'm doing. As people are trying to figure all this out, how, when would somebody need to offload this and connect with someone or something like Pixel Painter? When would they need to say, okay, this is at the bottom of my to-do list. Instead of keeping it there, I should just hand it over and ask for help through Pixel Painter, for example?
Oftentimes, a church will come to us and it's either the senior pastor, if it's a small church, the communication director, it's someone that's doing way too many things. And so they come to us and say, hey, I can do design. Maybe I even went to school or I like doing it, but I just have so many responsibilities that I'm not giving it the attention that it deserves. Like I just can't focus on everything else. And so most of the time for us, it's a decision of allowing that leader or pastor to get back to what they enjoy doing and what they need to be doing. And so offloading the design helps them get back to where their true calling is, where their heart is. We love doing what we do. Like we're passionate about design and serving the church and coming alongside the church, that this is our passion. And so we love to fit in with churches that need the design. Every church needs design help for sure, but we love to kind of fit in with pastors that are just overworked and they're adding graphic design to their plate and they're just pulling their hair out saying, I don't have time for everything. And so, a lot of these churches, we save them dozens of hours a month. And if you're sitting there There's one pastor we worked with where he'd do sermon series for the senior pastor, and he'd spend 20 hours a week doing these graphics just because he liked doing it, but he was very particular. And so helping him save that much time was a huge blessing.
So sometimes it's not even about like, I can't do it, but it's like, I can't spend this much time doing it. So that's a good point too. Like, it's not, people like me need a designer because we do not know what we are doing, but some people like it and they want to do it, but they can get in that rut of spending so much time doing it. So that's a good point.
I have one more question just to wrap it up. What's next for Pixel Painter? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, so we're slowly growing. I just brought on a video guy, and so we're adding video services to our list. So right now we do any sort of graphics, so sermon series graphics, event graphics, anything that's digitally designed. But now we have social media, website management, and video now. So we're, for us, we want to be the creative agency for churches. Like, we just love serving churches. We view this as our ministry to the local church. And so, the Lord willing, hopefully we can bless a lot of churches along the way. So that's upcoming.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Josh. Really appreciate you taking the time just to hang out and talk about design a little bit.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. Well, that's a wrap on today's show. You'll find a link to all of today's show notes, including how to get in contact with Josh, in the description below. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That'll make sure that you don't miss any future episodes.
On behalf of Church Juice and everyone at Reframe Ministries, thanks for watching. See you next week on the next episode.